A phone call suddenly cuts off in a crowded parking lot, and after that, a young woman vanishes without a trace. No security cameras capture the moment. No cries for help are heard. All that remains is an unlocked car, a newly purchased purse, and a knife sheath lying on the ground. The search quickly expands beyond a single small town, drawing in the FBI, thousands of volunteers, and authorities across 2 states as winter closes in. Behind what first appears to be a random disappearance is a man with a disturbing criminal past, and what no one expects is this: the tragedy would go on to change U.S. law forever. That tragic young woman was Dru Katrina Sjodin. Dru Katrina Sjodin was born on September 26, 1981, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She was the younger of 2 children born to her parents, Alan and Linda. When Dru was 3 years old, her parents divorced but remained on friendly terms. Starting when she was 10, she and her older brother, Sven, were raised by Linda and her second husband, Sid Walker, a travel agent. In a comfortable home on Whitefish Lake, Dru thrived in high school. She was an honors student, played on the golf team, and was crowned prom queen in 1999. But her true passion was art. Her bedroom at home was filled with sketches of rock stars, models, and friends. After graduating, she enrolled at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks. Friends described Dru as someone who loved life and was always ready to help others. She traveled around the country often, but her dream was to visit Australia, and she planned to go in the spring of 2004. To prepare for the trip and save more money, Dru worked 2 part-time jobs. She was a sales associate at Victoria's Secret and a server at a nightclub in Grand Forks. On Saturday, November 22, 2003, Dru's shift at the Victoria's Secret store in Columbia Mall ended at 4 p.m. Later that day, she planned to work at the nightclub. Before leaving the mall, Dru decided to do a little shopping and bought a handbag from one of the stores.
She made a phone call to her boyfriend, Christopher Lang, and she was speaking with Christopher as she was walking to her car.
Dru had been talking on the phone from roughly 5 p.m. to 5:04 p.m. to her boyfriend, and that phone call was interrupted, and she abruptly hung up. Prior to doing so, she said something along the lines of, "Okay, okay."
The call was disconnected, but Chris didn't give it much thought. There was nothing important they were discussing, and so he didn't call back. About 3 hours later, Chris's phone rang again.
Chris initially thinks Dru's going to call back. When 6 o'clock rolls around and he hasn't heard from her, he gets worried. He starts calling her and leaving messages. He also calls her roommate and learns she hasn't been back to their apartment.
Later in the evening, Dru's boyfriend, Chris, did receive a phone call from Dru's phone, but at that time there was no communication. All Chris was able to hear at that point was what sounded like the buttons being pushed, and that was approximately 7:42 p.m.
It would have been dark or getting to be dark at 5 o'clock. It was, November 22nd, so approaching the winter months.
Dru was living in a college dorm where she shared a room with a friend named Meg Murphy.
Dru's boyfriend calls Dru's roommate, Meg Murphy, again and suggests she try calling the bar where Dru was supposed to work a shift later that night.
She was employed at El Rocco Bar. She was supposed to work, I believe, at 9 p.m. that night, and she did not show up for work. They didn't think she would have not shown up for work without calling somebody or letting somebody know.
She was a responsible employee and always came to work early, so her absence immediately caused everyone's concern. However, Meg didn't know where Dru might be and was surprised that she hadn't shown up for work. Trying to find out where her friend Meg had disappeared, she first called mutual acquaintances and then called the local hospital, where she was told that Dru had not been admitted there. Around 9 p.m., unable to find out anything, Meg called the police.
Please come in. Hi, I'm calling. My roommate, was supposed to be home like a couple hours ago.
How old is she?
22.
Knowing that Dru worked at Columbia Mall, a police officer was dispatched there.
Drive down to the mall and see if I can spot her car.
At this point, the mall was already closed. Driving around the parking lot, the officer saw Dru's car upon.
We're in the northeast parking lot of the mall, outside the Penny's building, and Dru's car was parked in this space. Red Olds Cutlass was parked in this parking spot.
Examining it, he found that the car was unlocked.
By 11 o'clock when I got here, the lot was pretty much empty and there wasn't anybody around, so it was easy to find. I went and looked in the car. It looked like a bomb had gone off in the back seat, but then a lot of kids had cars like that. So I did find the bag with the purse that she bought at Marshall Fields. I locked it up. By the driver's side rear wheel was a black object. So it looked out of place. The knife sheath was laying by the left rear tire on the driver's side. I picked it up, put it in my pocket. I had no idea how important that piece of evidence was going to turn out to be.
First of all, detectives checked out Chris Lang.
As the search for Dru continues, police soon ask Dru's boyfriend, Chris, more questions, including why he didn't call police right away.
It wasn't a scream. It wasn't anything that it was just it cut off.
He was almost immediately ruled out as a suspect because he was in Minnesota, about 300 miles from Grand Forks.
He was in a relationship with her. We needed to verify his alibi. Oftentimes, the people close to the victim are responsible for their disappearance.
From Chris, police learned about the 2 calls Dru made, one that cut off abruptly, and a second one hours later that sounded like wind and button presses. The next day, when the mall reopened, detectives went to review the security footage. It turned out there were no cameras covering the part of the parking lot where Dru's car had been parked, but fortunately, there were many cameras inside the mall. As they watched, investigators saw Dru enter a local store after her shift and buy the handbag. She appeared calm and unhurried. She was wearing a pink sweater and carrying her coat. At 4:55 p.m., Dru paid, put on her coat, and left the store. On her way out, she called Chris at exactly 5 p.m. And as we know, at 5:04 p.m., the conversation was cut off right after she said, okay. Knowing the call ended after 4 minutes, a detective ran a simple test. He started a 4-minute timer and walked slowly from the store where Dru bought the bag to the spot in the parking lot where her car had been. When the timer went off, he was in the lot near the car. That suggested something happened when Dru reached her vehicle. But as mentioned, the lack of parking lot surveillance made the investigation far more difficult. Dru's disappearance drew media attention, and as a result, many people learned what had happened and refused to look away. In addition to police, more than 1,000 volunteers joined the search. FBI agents also became involved. The last call made from Dru's phone was traced to the small town of Fisher, Minnesota, only about a 30-minute drive from the mall. The area around these towns is mostly open farmland. Police used helicopters, all-terrain vehicles, horses, and dogs to search the fields. Landowners were asked to check their own property, but unfortunately, there were no leads at first. The search radius grew every day, and 4 days later came a disturbing discovery: a boot found beneath a bridge in Crookston.
Pretty much anything that could potentially be evidence, we were able to establish that with certainty that was Dru Sjodin's shoe.
Dru's roommate noted that on the day she disappeared, Dru had left wearing that pair of boots. Forensic testing later confirmed the boot belonged to the missing woman. Crookston is a small town with fewer than 10,000 residents, about 30 miles from Grand Forks, where Dru vanished. Further searches in the Crookston area didn't turn up anything else, and nothing significant emerged for investigators. An initial reward of $20,000 for information leading to Dru's whereabouts was later increased to $140,000. At that point, the only solid lead was the Columbia Mall surveillance footage. Detectives went back and reviewed hundreds of hours of video from multiple cameras, but this time, they weren't focused on Dru. They reasoned that the abductor might have been watching her and might appear somewhere on the recordings. Investigators spent hours in front of the screens before they finally noticed someone who stood out. A man wandering aimlessly around the mall, not buying anything, seemingly watching people more than merchandise. At 3:41 p.m., he sat on a bench near the mall exit and kept watching people walk past. After about 10 minutes, he stood up, pulled on black gloves, and walked into a corridor where a security camera was mounted overhead, one he appeared to look up at. The image was taken 72 minutes before Dru's conversation with her boyfriend was cut off and she disappeared. After watching the man get up and leave, investigators noticed he seemed to do so only when a blonde woman walked by carrying a shopping basket and heading toward the parking lot. Detectives didn't see it as a coincidence. To them, the man looked like he was selecting a suitable target and following her. The identity of that woman was never confirmed, but police knew that only Dru Sjodin disappeared from the mall parking lot that day. Because Dru bore a slight resemblance to the woman, investigators theorized the kidnapper may have had a specific type in mind. If this man really was the abductor and, for whatever reason, failed with the first woman, then his next target could have been Dru. She left the mall around 5 p.m., when it was already dark conditions that could have favored the attacker. At that point, the investigation centered on 3 towns: Grand Forks, where Dru was abducted; Fisher, where her phone last pinged; and Crookston, where the boot was found. With those data points, the FBI began reviewing the records of every registered sex offender in those towns and surrounding areas, comparing their booking photos to the surveillance images of the suspicious man from the mall. Only one person matched every criterion: Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., a man with a long, alarming history of crimes against women. The 50-year-old had spent 23 years behind bars. Rodriguez was the second of 5 siblings, born in February of 1953 in Laredo, Texas, to migrant workers Dolores and Alfonso Rodriguez Sr. Rodriguez later claimed he had an unhappy childhood, describing a tense home life shaped by harsh criticism and unreasonable demands from his parents. The family moved from state to state for 15 years before settling in Crookston in 1963. As he grew older, Rodriguez became increasingly isolated, made worse by a language barrier. Spanish was his preferred language, and he struggled with English, which made school especially difficult. He eventually dropped out in 9th grade and started working at the American Crystal Sugar Company plant in Crookston. Rodriguez also claimed that, when he was young, he had been abused by older women, something he said fueled deep emotional hostility toward women. In October of 1974, at age 21, he asked a woman for a ride home but directed her instead to a dead-end road in Crookston, where he grabbed her by the throat and tried to force himself on her. The following month, he approached another woman sitting in a truck outside a Crookston movie theater, threatened her with a knife, and ordered her to drive to a remote rural area, where he raped her. Then, in 1979, he attempted to kidnap a 69-year-old high school English teacher as she took a nighttime walk in Crookston. The woman fought back as Rodriguez tried to force her into his vehicle. In a rage, he stabbed her in the elbow and abdomen, but she escaped and ran to safety. The woman and artist later produced a sketch that closely resembled Rodriguez, leading to his arrest. He was convicted of attempted kidnapping and aggravated assault, and sentenced to 23 years in prison, serving until his release in May of 2003. He was released just 6 months before Dru disappeared and registered as a Level 3 sex offender, the highest classification, indicating the greatest risk of reoffending. Before his release, Rodriguez's family had expressed concerns to Minnesota Department of Corrections officials. They feared he would return to his old ways. But despite those concerns, Alfonso was freed because he had completed his sentence. After his release, Rodriguez lived with his mother in Crookston, only a few miles from the bridge where Dru's boot was found. Another troubling detail. Detectives decided to speak with Alfonso Rodriguez, and of course he denied any involvement in Dru's disappearance. He admitted he had been at Columbia Mall on the day she vanished, claiming he went to see the movie Once Upon a Time in Mexico. What he didn't realize was that no theater in Grand Forks was showing that film that day. Police searched Rodriguez's vehicle, and with what they found, they began to fear Dru was no longer alive. At this point, it appears there's no chance of finding Dru alive, Grand Forks County Sheriff Dan Hill told reporters. I believe this is a recovery mission more than a rescue mission now. Inside Rodriguez's car, dark red dried blood was discovered in multiple areas of the interior. Forensic testing later determined it was Dru's blood. Reports stated the blood was found on the rear passenger side window, the back seat, and 2 other areas of the passenger compartment. The blood matched Dru's DNA using a sample taken from her toothbrush. A folding knife found in the trunk matched the sheath discovered on the ground beside Dru's car in the parking lot. Investigators also found a receipt showing Rodriguez had purchased that knife and sheath at a hardware store just a few hundred yards from the parking lot where Dru disappeared. Even though Dru had not been found alive or dead, investigators had gathered enough evidence to charge Rodriguez. 8 days after her disappearance, on December 1, 2003, he was arrested. Held at the Grand Forks jail, Rodriguez again claimed he had nothing to do with it and refused to speak with law enforcement or provide any information about where Dru was. Despite the evidence against him, at a brief bail hearing a few days later, bail was set at an enormous $5 million. While he sat in jail refusing to talk, the search for Dru continued non-stop, focused around the three towns. The effort became even more difficult as heavy snow blanketed the region. In an unprecedented move, the governors of North Dakota and Minnesota pledged at a press conference on December 9th to support the search by deploying a few hundred National Guard members and other state personnel.
Everybody ready? Let's find her today. Go get Dru.
North Dakota Governor John Hoeven said Dru's disappearance was something that touched everyone in North Dakota. Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty told reporters he was proud of the cooperation and collaboration shown by the community and law enforcement officials. Despite every effort, nothing was found, and as weather conditions worsened, authorities decided to temporarily suspend search operations. In the spring, the intensive search resumed. Those looking for Dru hoped they would finally find her once the winter snow melted. After 5 long months of searching, they were desperate to bring her home. Finally, on April 17, 2004, Dru's body was discovered. It lay in a field outside Crookston, only a few miles from the bridge where her boot had been found. Dru's family was devastated when they received the heartbreaking news. Her father told reporters, "We've been waiting for that call, and when it came, all of us stopped living for a second. It was every parent's worst nightmare, and it would haunt them for the rest of their lives." The field where her body was found had been searched before, but it was clear that large snowdrifts had prevented searchers from finding her right away. Dru was nude from the waist down, making the offender's motive unmistakably clear. Her hands were bound behind her back. A cord had been wrapped around her neck, and cuts beneath it showed remnants consistent with a plastic bag, suggesting a bag had been placed over her head and then cinched tight around her neck with the cord. Hair consistent with Rodriguez's DNA was found on Dru's coat. Before her death, the young woman had been savagely beaten and stabbed multiple times. The medical examiner listed 3 possible causes of death: a cut to the throat, asphyxiation, or third hypothermia. On April 24, 2004, after months without answers, Dru's family was finally able to say goodbye. About 1,500 people attended her funeral that morning. On August 30th, 2006,
he was convicted, and since the case crossed state lines, he was sentenced to death in federal court. But in this new ruling, a federal judge has overturned that death sentence, writing, "While it is beyond question that Rodriguez abducted and murdered Sjodin, errors were made that violate the United States Constitution." The judge cited misleading testimony about Sjodin's cause of death and a failure to present information about Rodriguez's mental health that might have raised an insanity defense. Although his conviction still stands, the judge ordered a new sentencing.
On February 8, 2007, Judge Ralph Erickson addressed Rodriguez, who had maintained his innocence, saying the senseless and violent nature of his actions forced the jury and the court into a difficult decision. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. became the first person sentenced to death in North Dakota in nearly a century. After 6 years on death row, on June 28, 2013, Rodriguez confessed that he had abducted Dru and taken her life. But the story did not end there. Ralph Erickson, formerly the district judge who sentenced Rodriguez to death, later became a judge on the United States Court of Appeals, and in 2021, he overturned his own death sentence and ordered a new sentencing phase. Rodriguez's guilt was not in doubt, confirmed by multiple forms of DNA testing in the case. The issue was the death sentence. Erickson cited, among other things, the defense attorney's failure to properly evaluate Rodriguez's mental health and the testimony of forensic expert Michael McGee, testimony the judge said had misled him. That expert had testified that Rodriguez sexually assaulted Dru within 24 to 36 hours after the abduction. In reality, there was no direct evidence supporting that claim, such as Rodriguez's semen on Dru's body. According to the judge, the expert offered an opinion not grounded in facts, which misled the court and influenced the sentencing decision. Even while overturning the death sentence, Erickson noted that, even without physical evidence like semen, the circumstances of how Dru was found nude from the waist down hands bound behind her back still pointed to a sexually motivated crime. Judge Erickson said that failing to assess Rodriguez's mental health both generally and at the time of the crime violated his constitutional rights. After the death sentence was vacated, federal prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty again. However, 2 years later, in 2023, prosecutors dropped that plan and agreed to reduce Rodriguez's sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In a filing, the United States, through Max Schneider, U.S. Attorney for the District of North Dakota, withdrew the notice of intent to seek the death penalty against Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. that had been filed on October 28, 2004. In a court document dated March 14, Schneider stated that the United States no longer intended to pursue the death penalty in the case. He also said his thoughts were with Dru Sjodin's family, especially Linda Walker and Alan Sjodin, whom he described as truly good people and loving parents who, after an unimaginable loss, had worked closely with his office for nearly 20 years. He added that he wished them as much peace as possible. He also praised the trial team, including former U.S. Attorney Drew Wrigley, as well as appellate attorneys and support staff who had worked on the case over 2 decades, saying they consistently upheld the Department of Justice's high standards in their work on this tragic case. The statement concluded that, as a result of those efforts, Rodriguez was and would remain a convicted murderer. The withdrawal of the death penalty notice changed how the U.S. Attorney's Office would proceed in the case. What did not change was that Rodriguez would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. This case ultimately led to changes in sex offender registration laws. On July 27, 2006, President George W. Bush signed the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, which included what became known as Dru's Law. Dru's Law renamed the National Public Sex Offender Registry as the Dru Sjodin National Sex Offender Public Website, providing public information about the whereabouts of registered sex offenders across state, territory, and tribal boundaries.